E nā mātā wakarona hoi whā. O tai wiwi o tai wā no mai, haere mai, toia mai o tātou waka. Ki tēnei hui whakanui o Tehiringa waka. Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora tātou ko John Allen, tōku inua. My name's John Allen. I'm the Chancellor of Tehiringa Waka Victoria University. And it's a very great pleasure and privilege for me to welcome you all here for what I know is going to be an extremely stimulating conversation this evening. I know that because I know when you get diplomats and politicians, former or otherwise, and policy people and people who are deeply invested in the relationships of nations across our globe together, sparks fly sometimes, magic is made often, but ideas are generated which benefit all of us. And that's what I am hoping we will achieve tonight. Obviously, to catalyse that, we have John Kappa's excellent two reports which we are launching. Reports which have big ideas at the heart of each of them. The first big idea is that we can, as this little country of Aotearoa, New Zealand, engage that extraordinarily dynamic, sophisticated, young and growing community of nations which is Latin America, using, for example, our place in networks and whakapapa across the Pacific. And we can do that because this is the Pacific's time. This is a time when the Pacific Ocean, which of course represents about 20 or 30% of the world's surface, is not just seen as a community of tiny nations, but is seen as a community of tiny nations in a most important ocean for our planet. Important for the climate, important for the fisheries, important for so many reasons geopolitically right at the moment. So the Pacific, John is saying, can be an opportunity for leverage, for access, for engagement for Aotearoa New Zealand with Latin America. And then the second idea which to some New Zealanders will seem even more controversial, is that we could team up. We could team up with the Australians. We could team up with the Australians. We already have CER and so many other trade agreements with them. And we could use our collective efforts and energy, our collective status and understanding to have an impact in the trade infrastructure of Latin America. Both are big ideas. Both are ideas that have been talked about for many years. The CER-Mercosur arrangements have been talked about for a long, long time. But what John is postulating is that now is a time to act, not simply because the Australian-New Zealand Leadership Forum thought that we could now at last project ourselves together into the world, but because the geopolitical environment, because the climatic environment, because the all of the relationships that are necessary to address so many of the challenges of the world require that sort of engagement. And so in that spirit, recognising those very topical ideas, can I welcome you, can I encourage you to test your ideas today, to think creatively, because we know that Aotearoa New Zealand needs it. We know that the world needs it. And can I also just recognise in passing that given the opportunity represented by Latin America, given the opportunity represented by the reports John has presented, it is somewhat of a shame, in my view, that this extraordinary cape, which has enabled us to focus on Latin America, is to be defunded. And I just hope that John's right, that there are ideas and opportunities that can come that will take us beyond the cape into new thinking, new opportunities and new friendships. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai, tēnā tātou.
Kia ora Chancellor, kia ora tātou. Ko Matthew O'Mara o, ke roto e te Latin America Cape, he director o Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Bienvenidos and bienvenidos a todos. I'm Matthew O'Mara, the director of the Latin America Cape, and my team and I are delighted to welcome you all tonight on this fine but cold night while we're launching the reports that the Chancellor just referred to. I'd like to thank the Chancellor for his kind words of welcome. We're grateful to you for welcoming us to everyone here to our university. in your dual capacity really as Chancellor and as former Secretary of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Tonight we've got a mix of long-standing friends and people attracted to this specific event. There are a few I'd like to acknowledge. Obviously the author of the reports, John Kappa, Principal Consultant for MartinJenkins. The new Ambassador of Chile, who I'll introduce shortly, the Deputy High Commissioner for Australia. Our three panellists, the Honourable Tim Grosser, who's been a steadfast supporter of ours, Jackie Kane equally, and Professor David Capey. Other dignitaries we have among us, the ambassadors of Argentina, Brazil, Cuba and Peru, the High Commissioner of Samoa, representatives of the embassies of Mexico and Costa Rica and the British High Commission, the MFAT's Deputy Secretary for Asia and the Americas, Deborah Giles, the Assistant Vice-Chancellor Pacifica of our university, Dame Lua Manivo Winnie-Laban, former Chair of the Capes Advisory Board, if I can see him here, Alan Bollard, the Executive Director of Export New Zealand and the Chair and a fellow board member of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs. So for those of you who don't know us, normally what we do in these events, we give a big spiel about who the Cape is. We don't really need to do that because we're not going to be around too much longer. But in case you don't know who we are and the broader Cape project, this is just a little background to us. We are based at this university, but we're backed by a consortium of 3 other universities, 2 of whom are represented tonight, Waikato and Auckland, and Otago is the other university. We are, at the moment, New Zealand's only publicly focused entity, explicitly focused on Latin America. And if you to read a little bit more about us, we offer events, programs, aimed at a wide variety of people. Find out more about us, if you like, by the event below, the link below. Tonight is our latest piece of commissioned research. And these commissioned research pieces really are all about changing the conversation. Because while some of us, and I think almost all of you, if not all of you in the room, understand the Latin American opportunity, it's a fact that many people, including influential people, do not. And so that Latin America is often seen as marginal. We don't think it's marginal. And so we've produced these thought pieces to try and help people appreciate the Latin American opportunity and learn about it more and see why it is important to this nation, society and economy. So that was the first report we launched a couple of years ago. We've also launched a couple of more earlier this year, including one which we'll probably refer to frequently tonight. So this is the context. This is our latest thought leadership piece, if you will. But to understand the 2 pieces of research that we're about to have summarised for us effectively, we thought we'd put them in context. So we've actually got 3 people from the government sector, from different governments, talking a little bit about the topic to get you thinking about it so you'll be ready for when the report and the panel afterwards are presented. So our first speaker is New Zealand's Associate Minister of Defence, among other portfolios, the Honourable Chris Penk, and he's going to just say a few words to you about the current state of New Zealand-Latin American relations.
Buenas tardes. Thank you to the Latin American Centre for Asia Pacific Excellence and your invitation to speak today and the initiative behind this event. I'd like to start by acknowledging our distinguished guests, including members of the diplomatic corps and business community. Your presence here highlights the connections between Latin America, Australia, the Blue Pacific and New Zealand. That is the reason why you're here today. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity, particularly following my visit to Arequipa, Peru, earlier this year, where I attended the annual Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, Ministers Responsible for Trade meeting on behalf of our Minister for Trade, Todd McClay. Regional mechanisms such as APEC are a vital opportunity for New Zealand to foster closer ties with Latin American partners. Peru's hosting of APEC this year has presented further opportunities for collaboration with Latin America, and we're grateful for Peru's efforts to refocus attention on APEC's core mission of regional economic integration. The theme of their host year, Empower, Include and Grow, encapsulates the essence of New Zealand's trade relationship with Latin America. We've seen promising growth in recent years with the entry into force of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. That was a milestone, of course, marking our first free trade agreement with Mexico and Peru and cementing our long-standing trade ties with Australia and Chile. This agreement has created new opportunities for New Zealand business in the Latin American market and led to growing investment in the region. Looking ahead, the New Zealand government has set an ambitious target to double exports by 2033. Eliminating or lowering tariffs is essential to achieve this goal and for our exports to remain competitive overseas. We're working to advance this in Latin America through our work together to expand CPTPP to economies that can adhere to its high standards, and through our aspiration to become an associate member of the Pacific Alliance. We often look to our closest friends, Australia, when developing innovative and creative trade policies, and Latin American countries have also become key partners in these initiatives. Thank you for that. Our collaboration with Chile through the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, or DEPA, aims to facilitate paperless trading, build up digital trust, and foster collaboration on emerging issues such as AI and fintech. Our partnerships with Australia, Costa Rica, Chile, Ecuador, and Mexico in the Inclusive Trade Action Group, ITAG, and with Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Peru in the Global Trade and Gender Arrangement, GTAGA, highlight the scope and dynamism of the trade relationship between the two regions. In the last month, we were also pleased to wrap up negotiations on the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability with Costa Rica, Iceland and Switzerland, our first trade agreement with each of these countries. It's a first of its kind agreement which brings together some of the interrelated elements of the climate change, trade and sustainable development agendas. The sustainability agenda will become ever more important as we continue to pursue global market openness and is specifically relevant to our Blue Pacific neighbours' unique vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. Of course, these agreements are more than just formalities. They are crucial tools that help businesses navigate an increasingly complex world and create opportunities for growth. They also reflect the shared values of our societies, our commitment to ensure that the benefits of trade reach all of our communities, and exemplifies our broader bilateral, multilateral and people-to-people connections. As the global trade landscape faces challenges, we can no longer be confident that the trend toward global market openness will continue. The rules-based trading system is increasingly at risk. Latin American countries and Australia are important partners in regional and multilateral fora to support the WTO and the multilateral trading system and to keep us moving forward. It is vital that like-minded countries work together as we pursue shared goals on the global stage and seek to improve market access. I look forward to the opportunity to visit the region again. Muchas gracias, and thank you very much.
So we're grateful to the Minister for making those remarks because he did want to come tonight, but he was unable to join us. So he readily agreed, and I think in 4 minutes gave a great précis of where the relationship currently stands. So that's New Zealand. So let's look at one of the other actors that we're looking at tonight. So we need to hear from our neighbours to the west. And so at this point, I'd like to invite Amy Gio, Deputy High Commissioner in the Australian High Commission here down the road, to offer some brief reflections on Australia's relations with Latin America, to put in context some of the ideas that John will present later. So Amy, please.
Enya mana, enya reo, enya iwi, e reo rangitirama, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening. It's a genuine pleasure to join you all today. I first want to thank the Latin America Centre for Asia Pacific Excellence and Dr. Matthew Omar for the invitation to speak this evening at the launch of the 2 latest Commission reports. John Allen, Chancellor of Victoria University, thank you for your welcoming remarks. I'd also like to congratulate the report author, John Kappa, and this evening's discussion panellists, Tim Grosser, Jackie Kane and Professor David Capey. I'm sure everyone's looking forward to what will be an interesting discussion. I acknowledge the Ambassador of Chile, Her Excellency Ms. Manahi Pakarati, and other members of the Diplomatic Corps here this evening. I'm delighted to have the opportunity tonight to discuss Australia's broad interests with Latin America. There are clear gains to be made for both Australia and New Zealand by establishing deeper ties with Latin America. The incentives for both countries to work closely together to form these connections are clear, And in fact, we already collaborate a great deal on our shared interests in the region. I'll elaborate on that more later, but first I think it's important that I touch on why Latin America is important to Australia. Strengthening our partnerships with Latin America matters for three main reasons. First, Australia already has significant economic interests in and with Latin America. Currently, there are around 300 Australian companies active in Latin America, with total investments worth over 28 billion in 2023. That's actually more than our investment in India, Indonesia and Vietnam combined. Latin America investment in Australia is also growing, with around 5 billion from Chile and Brazil alone. Second, there's considerable scope for Australia to expand our investment and to diversify our trade links into the region. And I'm going to use a few acronyms here, and thankfully Associate Minister Penk did explain quite a few of those, so I'll just use the shortened versions if that's okay. Our solid trade architecture, including through the CPTPP and free trade agreements with Chile and Peru, present opportunities to expand Australia's agriculture, education and services exports. There are also growing investment opportunities in critical minerals, renewable energy, infrastructure and digital services. The growing Latin American diaspora in Australia, now totaling over 250,000, is also playing an important role in forging two-way trade, investment and people-to-people links. But Latin America is not just important to Australia because of its economic significance. The third reason Latin America matters is because of our shared interests and values in the multilateral system. Latin American countries play an influential role multilaterally and are often like-minded on priority issues for Australia. Whether at the WTO, the UN, APEC or global climate change negotiations, what Latin America does in the multilateral system, including on rules, standards and norms, matters to countries like Australia and New Zealand. And importantly, Australia and Latin American countries are aligned on priority issues, including on trade, climate change, democracy, gender equality and the rights of First Nations people. As a result, there's considerable scope for Australia to work more closely with Latin American countries to progress these shared multilateral priorities. So what about the role for trans-Tasman collaboration? How does that play in our relationship with Latin America? As we all know, there are few countries in the world as close as Australia and New Zealand. The beauty of our unique relationship is that what is good for Australia is generally good for New Zealand and vice versa. When we work together on the global stage, it benefits us both. For example, economic security is deeply entrenched in both of our national interests. As trade-reliant economies, with trade representing almost half of Australia's GDP and around 60% of New Zealand's, promoting trade is key to building the secure and stable economic future that we both want. Trade diversification remains central to Australia's trade policy, and New Zealand is a critical partner for us in this effort. In the Latin American region, Australia and New Zealand work closely through forums such as APEC, the WTO, the Cairns Group and CPTPP to execute common objectives on global trade liberalisation. Australia and New Zealand also collaborate closely when engaging with Latin America on our shared interests and values in the multilateral system, such as democratic principles, human rights and gender equality. Moving forward, as both countries develop their connections in the region, it's critical that we continue to foster a strong trans-Tasman dialogue on Latin America. Events such as this, which encourage policy contestation and bring new ideas to the table, are always welcome. I would like to congratulate the Latin America Centre for Asia Pacific Excellence on the release of its two newest reports. I'm grateful to have been invited tonight to share Australia's perspectives and priorities, and I'm looking forward to what I'm sure will be a very thought-provoking discussion this evening. Thank you.
It's now my honour to invite Chile's new ambassador to New Zealand, Her Excellency Manahi Pakarati, to the podium. The ambassador is a graduate of this university, and more relevantly, perhaps, she's also from Rapa Nui, and thus is a perfect person to comment on relations related to the other report we're launching, relations between Chile and the Pacific. So, Your Honor, Embajadora, please invite you to speak as well. Thank you.
Kei ngā manukura, kei ngā piki amukura tēnā koutou. Tēnā tātou me ngā tini aitua o te wā. Nau mai rā koutou ki tēnei huihuinga e tuitui nei i a tātou i tēnei rā. E mihi nui ana kia koutou kua tae mai nei, tēnā koutou kato. Kia ora, Yorana, buenas tardes. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear ambassadors and friends. I would like to start by introducing myself to those who don't know me. My name is Manahi Pakarati, and I am the only diplomat of Polynesian origin in the Chilean Foreign Service. Today, I have the honor of representing my country as its ambassador in New Zealand, and I'm also privileged of being appointed as the ambassador of Chile to Fiji, the Cook Islands, Samoa, the Kingdom of Tonga, and Niue. The Chile and New Zealand relationship started before our two countries were even born. My Polynesian ancestors navigated by the stars from west to east, thousands of kilometers across the Pacific Ocean, populating nearly every island on their way. That's how they arrived in my beloved island, called Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island. Not long after that, Eastern Polynesians, following their sailing traditions, arrived in Aotearoa in several waves of canoe voyages. Over centuries in isolation, these settlers developed their own distinctive culture, language, mythology, craft, and performing arts, and today they are called Maori people. Chile won its independence in 1810. Almost 80 years after that, in 1888, the chiefs of my island decided to sign an agreement of wills with representatives of the Chilean government, through which Rapa Nui became a special territory of my country. My country's mainland has more than 8,000 kilometers of coastline along the Pacific Ocean, from north to south. So the relationship between Chile and the sea is also long and close. We don't see the ocean as a barrier between us and our neighbors. For us, it is actually the ocean that connects us all. Being half-caste Polynesian and Latin, I have the advantage of being able to see Latin America through the eyes of a Pacific Islander, and to see the ocean through the eyes of a Latin American citizen. The MartinJenkins report that the Latin America Cape is presenting today is right with its statement that Latin American countries see New Zealand as having a deeper understanding and relationship with the countries and territories of the Pacific. New Zealand can definitely help us to engage more effectively with them. Chile considers New Zealand an important ally in the Blue Pacific region. Our diplomatic relations were established in 1945, and the opening of our first embassies in each other's capital in 1972. This makes us long-standing friends. As small countries, all Pacific nations and territories, Latin American coastal countries with interests in the Pacific and New Zealand, need each other to deal with the threats we are facing nowadays, like environmental issues, security concerns, and illegal fishing. We also need to find more ways of collaborating on issues of shared interest. Unfortunately, the report is also right when it says that the consistent engagement between Latin American countries and the nations of the Pacific is thin and episodic at best. In this scenario, Chile has made permanent effort to improve this situation by looking for opportunities to get closer to the Pacific neighbors and to strengthening through bilateral and multilateral mechanisms its presence in the Blue Pacific region. One of these efforts led us to finally being accepted as a dialogue partner of the Pacific Island Forum in December 2021. I had the honor to be the head of delegation that represented Chile for the first time at the 52nd PIF meeting in Rarotonga last year, and I will have the privilege of representing my country again in Tonga at the end of this month. My personal wish is that one day we are accepted as a full member. The Pacific Ocean ecosystems are of vital economic and cultural significance to Pacific peoples and countries. As part of the Pacific Rim, Chile shares the concerns about the impact of climate change and sea level rise in the region. We all face common issues linked to the depletion of ocean resources and the degradation of marine ecosystems, land and ocean pollution, lack of effective waste management strategies and programs, and inefficient use of energy. We must be able to address the challenges we face by strengthening cooperation and combining effort to protect the ocean environment and resources from exploitation, degradation, and pollution. An important mechanism to address these issues together is the agreement signed under the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea called Marine Biodiversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, also known as BBNJ. Chile has ratified its commitment to sustainable economic and environmental policies by launching its proposal to host the Secretariat of BBNJ in Valparaiso, a Pacific coastal Chilean city. We have the conviction that bringing the Secretariat to Chile is an important shift of relevant international governance to a country in the global south. Likewise, it is a way of building bridges for the creation of new knowledge in research centers focused on Pacific peoples and preserving traditional knowledge to be applied in modern settings and to contemporary challenges and opportunities. Marine pollution is also a big concern for my country. That's why between the 3rd and the 5th of April 2024, we hosted in Rapa Nui the first Pacific Leaders Summit on micro and macroplastic pollution of the oceans and shores. In that opportunity, we received delegations from Australia, Canada, China, Ecuador, Fiji, France, French Polynesia, New Caledonia, Japan, United Nations, New Zealand, Palau, Peru, Tonga, and Tuvalu. Additionally, my country also participates as a full member together with New Zealand in the South Pacific Defense Ministers Meetings, SPDMN. We are looking forward to this year's meeting in October in Auckland. Here, we look forward to discussing with Latin America, New Zealand, and the countries of the territories of the Pacific the need for greater engagement on security issues. For example, to address the growth of transnational organized crime, training and capacity building opportunities, disaster response collaboration, and dealing with illegal fishing. In a different but related context, Rapa Nui is a member of the Council of Pacific Arts and Culture, which provides us the opportunity to enhance engagement with other Pacific islands. A delegation of 180 Rapa Nui people participated in the Festival of Pacific Arts in Hawaii in June this year, giving us the opportunity to celebrate the richness and diversity of the culture of 27 island nations and territories. Despite all this effort, we still have a long way to go. From my perspective, Latin American countries can definitely seek to increase their engagement with the Pacific hand in hand with Aotearoa. We are 6 resident ambassadors of Latin American countries in New Zealand, and there are 9 other non-resident representations accredited here. Our presence proves that our countries have genuine interest in the Blue Pacific continent and that we recognize the value of our relations with all its members. Even though our resources are limited, we will do our best to continue working to engage in a collaborative and mutually beneficial way. As for me being part of this Pacific family, I would like to finish by saying what Professor Epeli Hau'ofa taught us. E hara I te mea kia noho ko te iti o tātou moutere hei whakatauki mā te ao, engari ia te nui whakaharahara o tātou moana. He moana tātou, he moana waiwai, ko te ao moana ko tātou tērā. We should not be defined by the smallness of our islands, but in the greatness of our oceans. We are the sea, we are the ocean, Oceania is us. Thank you very much. Maururu, kia ora, muchas gracias.
Maururu, Ambassador, y muchísimas gracias. Your presence here, as you say, is a sign of Chile's desire to get closer to Aotearoa and Polynesia, and we wish you every success for your posting. It is now my pleasure to invite the author of the reports we are launching to the stage. John Capper is a former New Zealand ambassador to Chile, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, and Ecuador. And he led the successful responses of his consultancy firm, MartinJenkins, to the request for proposals we put out. After that, along with colleagues in his company, including Malin Harvey, who is with us today, he engaged fully with the academic, business and government advisors we asked him to consult with in preparing both reports. 2 of those advisors are on our panel. Amber Walters from New Zealand's Parliament is also with us. The final results we know are eloquent, and it is my pleasure to invite John to present them to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Kia ora, nice to see you all. Nice to see some former colleagues and current colleagues here, and also my 2 children who want to know what it is that Dad does, who are sitting up at the back. Great to see you here. I've been given the task of trying to summarise these 2 reports in quite a short amount of time. And if you've ever worked on something quite closely, you'll know that every single point is incredibly important. So trying to boil them down to little 8-minute snippets is a challenge. However, I think it's already been done by my colleagues, my former boss, John Allen, who actually summed them up pretty well to begin with. And then thank you, Deputy High Commissioner and Ambassador, also for referring to the reports. So the idea is to go through each report separately and to talk about them one after another and then hand over to the panel. But first of all, I'm John Capper. I'm a principal consultant at MartinJenkins. I was in the New Zealand Foreign Ministry for about 20 years, 3 years as ambassador in Latin America, and 4 years as Deputy High Commissioner in Port Vila, Vanuatu. I now work for MartinJenkins, and I am the co-author of these reports. One of the other co-authors, Malin Harley, is here. She worked with me on the Blue Pacific report. And I would also like to acknowledge the many experts, academics, business people, politicians who we spoke to on both reports, some of whom were on the reference group and really helped us sharpen these up. So it was a team effort with a number of people involved. So we will begin with Trans-Tasman collaboration to build ties with Latin America with a map that might be slightly out of whack, but most New Zealanders will feel that that's what it looks like. So we were commissioned by the Latin American Cape to highlight sectors where the potential for Trans-Tasman alliances are greatest, working with Latin America, explain the benefits and also the barriers to working together in Latin America, and then discuss some of the ways we might overcome these barriers. The key question, can Australia and New Zealand compete and collaborate at the same time in a way that benefits both Tasman neighbours and also benefits countries in Latin America, was what we sought to answer. So what did we find? We spoke to experts, as I said before. We ran workshops, we analysed a range of documents, and we started from the point of view of what are our trade and economic and also diplomatic interests. And we thought about a time horizon of around 5 to 20 years out. Where do Australia and New Zealand's interests align, and what is the sweet spot? And what we found was there could absolutely be a case, as the Deputy High Commissioner has said, for Australia and New Zealand to collaborate in some areas to protect and advance our interests, and that this joint approach could give our efforts more impact and also make them more cost-effective in these fiscally constrained times. And while Australia and New Zealand do compete, for example, the international education sector, and that's great, there are areas where collaboration could pay dividends, where we don't compete, and where combining our efforts would benefit Latin America and Latin American countries' own strategic interests. So getting into a bit more detail, we really do focus on trade and economic interests in the paper, as well as Australia and New Zealand's diplomatic interests. And in the trade and economic space, in an unpredictable and contested world that we see at the moment, countries and companies that trade across borders need to diversify and de-risk. Diversify, seek new markets and new partners, and not rely on one or two, and de-risk their relationships as much as possible by building resilience and depth through having multiple connection points. And this is the challenge for New Zealand and Australia at the moment. Latin America offers New Zealand and Australia the opportunity to both de-risk and diversify their trade and economic relationships, and also to deepen coalitions on key issues. And I think Latin America is perhaps unique in this regard, in that we assess there is significant upside and untapped potential in the trade and economic relationship based on the relatively low level of trade, especially in the case of New Zealand with Latin America, and the large markets that Latin America represent. And we do see a really modest trade and economic relationship with Latin America. And the fact that Australia and New Zealand share many values and interests with Latin America offers the potential to build that relationship resilience that New Zealand and Australia need. It takes time to build these links, and in the case of Latin America, Australia and New Zealand do not offer a significant market, especially considering their close ties to North America and to Europe, so we have to pitch ourselves in a different way. We have to build that resilience and open opportunities for the future through exploring a more strategic approach to Latin America, and we propose in the report to focus on ideas and networks. And given that this report, as Matthew has said, is the part of a long line of reports that the Cape has commissioned, in the picture of Medellin and the metro cable in Medellin is a quote from a report by co-authored by Senores Grosser and Nixon. The objective is to maximise our chances of improving our relationships across a range of activities to provide alternative destinations for New Zealand ideas and trade and add resilience to our economic and social connections, which I think is beautifully put. And that report, which NZIER authored or delivered, focuses on the bilateral relationship between New Zealand and Latin America. So there are areas where New Zealand and Australia can build this connection, deepen this connection, and add resilience to our relationships in a shaky world. My experience in Latin America illustrated that the Latin American countries have deep interest in New Zealand and Australia. We have a great brand there. And that we focus in the report on ideas, international issues, and networks. And I won't go into too much detail here. You can see them on the screen. But ideas such as Indigenous issues, innovation, particularly in the agriculture and mining sectors, environmental protection, and international issues. We share a lot of the same views on things such as trade liberalisation and human rights. And in networks, New Zealand offers Latin America, I guess, a platform or a way into Asia and the Pacific through long-established relationships that we've built in those regions. And of course, the second report, which I'll talk about tonight, deals specifically with the Pacific. And I think the key idea here is that these links do not guarantee that private sector will walk through the door, but they establish the possibility. They sort of open the door and enable a greater engagement over time. How to do this? Whoops. How to do this? Always the challenging thing. In the case of New Zealand, more so than Australia, I think, our interest in Latin America has ebbed and flowed over time in terms of official engagement. When I was ambassador in Chile, I took former Prime Minister John Key through Colombia and Chile as part of a regional visit to Mexico and Brazil as well. And Minister Grosser was a regular visitor. In fact, I remember my son Sam hitting him for 6 over the top of the residence one day in the backyard. He came through quite often. These high-level visits help highlight opportunities and open doors, but behind that you do need a sustained effort, which is what our report is saying. In other regions, New Zealand and Australia has done this remarkably well. I think about the Asia New Zealand Foundation, for example, the Track 2 approach, the diplomacy, the trade that we've built over time in Asia. It is absolutely possible. However, in the case of Latin America, maybe that level of investment is too much in these constrained times. So we do propose that existing organisations and initiatives on both sides of the Tasman could be supported to change their scope and focus to take a more strategic approach. In other words, let's not build some new architecture, let's not do something new. Let's use what we've already got, but tweak it to include Latin America or to broaden it out to include Latin America. And the approach could start off by focusing on a small number of areas where trans-Tasman interests align, such as ideas and networks that I've mentioned, with clear deliverables and measurable goals. That's a consultant in me talking, deliverables and goals, I love that stuff. Keep it focused, leverage existing experts, the good brands that we have, and most importantly, sustain it. Think 20 years, not 2 years. So I really look forward to the panel discussion on this one, and I will move on to New Zealand, Latin America, and the Blue Pacific. Report 2. So I'm going to follow the same approach here. We were commissioned to provide insights into areas and sectors with the highest potential for collaboration between New Zealand, Latin America and the Pacific, explore economic, geopolitical and socio-cultural factors that drive collaboration, examine the barriers and also the benefits that collaboration may deliver, and look at incentives that may be needed to foster collaboration. And we had two key questions that we tried to answer that we worked with our reference group and with the people that we interviewed on. What are the benefits for New Zealand, Latin America and the Pacific Islands from closer collaboration on issues of shared interest? And how can New Zealand shape how Latin American countries engage with the Pacific Islands in a way that both aligns with New Zealand's interests and also benefits the Pacific? And the Ambassador, I think, has talked about this in her remarks at the beginning. So, what did we find? First of all, while this series of report that the Cape has commissioned does focus on benefits to New Zealand, given the importance of a stable and prosperous Pacific to New Zealand's national interests, we put the Pacific in the centre of this report. And there are a number of clear places where the interests of the Pacific, New Zealand and Latin America do intersect, which I'll talk about shortly. And moreover, as noted in the previous report, if New Zealand is looking to grow its value proposition to Latin America, its links into the Pacific is one area where this could happen. So before I get to the specific areas, what is the Blue Pacific? Those of us that have worked in the Pacific a lot sort of know what it is, but it's sort of a new concept that Pacific leaders themselves have articulated. It's sort of amongst other things, it's a response to geopolitics and an attempt to give the Pacific a voice on the global stage on the issues that affect it. I.e. the Pacific is not a big empty ocean, it's a continent of peoples that has interests that the world should take notice of. And there are a range of shared interests that could see increased Latin America interest and engagement in the region, including peace and security, ocean and environment with a focus on fisheries. And this is what the report focuses on. And the Ambassador has mentioned these too in her remarks. So peace and security. We talk about in the report geopolitical rivalry, diplomatic recognition, lobbying for UN votes and transnational crime. These are areas where a more complex and contested world is leading other countries to engage more with the Pacific. They're called non-traditional actors in some cases. We think that some Latin American countries may well decide it is also in their interest to engage in the region on these issues. Ocean and environment. These are issues that affect the daily lives of Pacific people and also the economies of New Zealand, Latin America, or those Latin American countries that either have a Pacific coastline or fishing fleets and that rely on the ocean for livelihoods and food security. And as the report discusses, climate change and ocean temperature changes are altering the migration patterns of key fish stocks. This becomes a geopolitical, economic stability issue. Marine pollution is another factor, and deep sea mining, while offering potential economic benefits, also presents a range of environmental risks that are not yet fully understood. And these all are issues of high importance to the Pacific Rim countries and Pacific Island countries. And then finally, we do talk a lot about countries coming into the Pacific, but it's also in the Pacific's interest to engage outwards. They're probably the most impacted region by climate change on the planet, and it could be in the Pacific's interest to engage more closely with Latin American countries. And we mentioned Brazil, Mexico and Argentina, G20 countries, large economies, to try and lobby or influence policy positions based on the threat of climate change to the Pacific. So, the how. As the report discusses, Latin America, New Zealand and the Pacific already engage in a number of targeted fora, often fisheries focused. We think it's in everyone's interest that any future or increased Latin American engagement in the region is informed, relevant and offers benefits to the Pacific. And there's an opportunity for New Zealand to work with Latin America in this regard. And while the mechanisms exist in some cases, it might be more about New Zealand taking a more strategic approach, especially in the areas highlighted in this report. And the report talks about official government to government, bilateral, multilateral, international negotiations and processes, people to people connections, including the Polynesian Triangle or the Polynesian Connections, and other institutions that engage with Latin America, such as institutions like the Cape, science and research organisations as well. So that is a very quick summary of the two reports. You'll have copies. I hope you enjoy them. And I now look forward to hearing the panel's discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. You can take a rest now. You see, he can condense quite a lot of information into a short amount of time. I'd like to now invite our panellists up to the stage, please. Firstly, the Honourable Tim Grosser, former New Zealand Trade and Climate Change Minister and Ambassador to the United States and the WTO. Jackie Kane, one of, Jackie, I forget, predecessor or successor to, successor?
Well, predecessor in Pakarati and successor in Chile.
Okay, so these two have been following each other around the place, but now Group-Headed Strategy and Environment for Te Runanga o Ngāi Tahu in Canterbury, and Professor David Capey, Director of the Centre for Strategic Studies here at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. Some short questions, because we've got so much to talk about, not a lot of time. So my first one actually goes to Tim, and it's about the Trans-Tasman report and the broader question of Trans-Tasman collaboration. I mean, is it realistic to sort of posit that Australia and New Zealand can collaborate on such matters? So maybe if you could just share from your own experience as a minister or before then as a trade negotiator, times that you know that Wellington and Canberra have actually increased their impact by working together, particularly in relation to Latin America, by collaborating rather than competing.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to congratulate the Centre for this, unfortunately, the final piece of work. If I'd been the minister, you would have received tens of millions of dollars more money. You understand that, don't you?
Thank you, Tim.
Yes. Well, even though I've been out of politics for a few years, I haven't lost the art of overpromising. This, excuse me making comments that relate very much to my personal experience, but you have explicitly asked me to do that. And I'd like to start at the very foundation stone of it, CER, because I worked on the Australia-New Zealand economic relationship for 7 years of my life. And very important to realise that the Australian view of the CER was always, we need to sort out this idiotic trade and economic relationship we have with New Zealand under the old NAFTA agreement and update it into a forward-looking new agreement. And this is quite explicit in the agreement. I know that in Article 2 of the CER, they talk about, the phrase relates to Southeast Asia, but that was because Australia and New Zealand in 1979 were really focusing on the immediate Southeast Asian region, but it should be interpreted more broadly. And all of my career, this has been this Australian view of New Zealand, that we work together for shared goals, has been, if you like, a dominant theme of all the activities that I've been involved in, both as a senior New Zealand official and as later as Minister of Trade and Climate Change. So the underlying theme of the report is, to me, makes perfect political sense. Now, if we look at, for example, our shared interests, the Cairns Group was a natural expression of that. It's no longer the force it was for reasons I could explain, but we don't have time. And then the whole expansion of the original agreement that established TPP, the P4 agreement, which, you know, I set up with Alejandro Jara, Ricardo Lagos, and Giorgio in Singapore. That was always about this shared Australasian view. There was a reason why Australia had not come into that agreement at the start. I won't go there, I haven't got time. But now that Australia has now joined the final result, what you're talking about makes perfect sense. Now, because of time limitations, I'll just make one sort of general comment. and I could go on to the Cartagena Dialogue and the Global Research on Alliance on Agriculture Emissions, but I have a sense that we're in very, very unusual times right now in which so many of the pillars that people like me and you, John, and others in this room have worked on, the sort of the shared commitment to multilateralism, particularly in the trade and economic area, the Washington consensus are no under threat. And I think that you've got to go back and look at our shared interests, particularly with the more outward-looking Latin American countries, as having renewed significance, because for the next few years, the real battle, I think, will be to preserve as much of the acquis, if I can use the French concept, the sense of the commitments we've got in place to keep openness, peace, and prosperity moving. This is going to be quite a bloody struggle, actually. And I think that that frames our relationship with like-minded countries and Australia in the right framework.
Well, thank you for those remarks. Referring to your $10 million over-promising to our centre, can I ask you what you think about the report and the report's idea that New Zealand and Australia could resource something to look deep in our relationship with Latin America more? Is that feasible in the current context? Or if not in the current context, is it feasible in a future context?
I've got an open mind on it. I do strongly endorse what John Kappa was saying about, don't endlessly invent new institutions to deal with the problem. I mean, in a talk like this, it's typical you'll get the same bunch of people who are interested in broader ideas coming along to everything. We in New Zealand are simply too small to sustain too many of these track 2 institutions. I had hoped, frankly, that we might have had an inventive look at the Asia-New Zealand Foundation and putting in a Latin component, because I don't really see the underlying role of track 2 diplomacy. I used to be the executive director of the foundation, as fundamentally different, particularly given the linkages between the coastal states of Chile, Peru, and others, and what we're trying to achieve in Asia. It's all part of the same mix. But my advocacy fell on deaf ears. All I know is that it's well worth exploring with Australia to see if there would be some interest on this. And I retain an open mind on the matter.
Well, thank you for those thoughts. Jackie, if I could turn to you now, there were basically 2 geneses of this report. One was the map behind us, thinking it's okay to talk about the Pacific Rim, but what about the middle of the Pacific, the societies and cultures of the Pacific? So that was one of the geneses. The other was actually I had a brief 2-year experience in an embassy myself, and Australia and New Zealand did collaborate on a scholarship agreement with Chile. So I saw it on the ground. So my first question to you was, when you were an ambassador in Santiago, did you see such evidence of Australia and New Zealand lobbying on the ground, be it in Chile or the other countries you were accredited to? And did it have an impact?
Kia ora koutou and moi buenas tardes a todos. First, I'd just like to tautoko what Tim was saying about the value of having an agency such as this to be able to pull together the whakaaro around what are those opportunities for collaboration and keeping in place, I think, the great relationships that have been built over the decades. As a former board member on the Cape Advisory Board, I really saw the value of the work that this particular Cape was doing. So I do hope that there is some way that we can preserve the great work that's been taking place and take that into the future. Coming to your question, Matthew, I think I reflected back both in my time in Mexico and then in Chile about some of the collaboration, trans-Tasman collaboration that we did in terms of advocacy around Pacific interests in Latin America. One of the kaupapa that stands out for me was around SPRIFMO, the South Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Organisation. So, talking about, the fisheries being one of those really critical sectors that brings together environmental issues, trade and economic issues, sustainability. That was a space in which Australia and New Zealand did engage with Latin America to really advocate in relation to what was happening with the SPRIF negotiations, to be able to provide another perspective on some of the Pacific views around that particular fishery as well, and its interrelationship with some of the other regional fisheries management organisation negotiations that were being undertaken at that time. I think, and this is something that we discussed in the drafting of this report, that the real challenge is providing a space where there's actually a mandate for Australia and New Zealand to go in and speak on behalf of, or to advocate on behalf of the Pacific. We know we have a lot of engagement directly with Pacific Island countries, and I think in the instance of SPRIFMO, because we are part of the Pacific Island Forum, kind of caucusing on fisheries negotiations, that was a space that I feel that Australia and New Zealand was able to step into in a safe way. But I think the challenge as we go forward is, what is that sweet spot that John referred to, or that Venn diagram of us, trans-Tasman interests, Latin American interests and Pacific interests, and where is the value add that New Zealand and Australia can be providing, and sort of making those connections and sort of ensuring that that investment is to the best benefit of all three regions.
Absolutely. I mean, the value add or the value proposition is sort of an idea which came through particularly in the Pacific report. How can New Zealand be more important to Latin America? How can the Pacific be more important? How can Latin America be more important to the Pacific, et cetera, et cetera? So one of the key parts, of course, which people talk about in the value proposition of this society towards Latin America is Indigenous issues. So in what ways, reading both reports, from your background and as a Māori ambassador, but also your role in Ngāi Tahu, an advisor to the report, how do you think these connections can be boosted in the future between New Zealand, Australia and Latin America in relation to the Pacific here, especially as we're about to go? And by the way, thank you for your work on our advisory board too.
Well, I think, as Ambassador Manahi kind of referred to, these connections are long-standing, that they predate our creations as sort of modern states, if you will. So I think there's both an acknowledgement of those ancestral connections, and I think that's something that can be brought into modern-day statecraft as well. I was with the former Foreign Minister Nanaia Mahuta up in Japan, and we were talking about its culture first, then its connection, and then its commerce. So the culture is what actually brings people together as humans. It creates that hono, that connection between people, and that enables you to establish business relationships and then undertake the trading. And I think that's a real advantage that New Zealand has in our connections both with the Pacific and Latin America through that Polynesian connection. But I think there's also modern day ways in which we can be ensuring that there's strong Indigenous voice coming through in a lot of the foreign policy and global challenges that we face. I think about climate change and the bringing in mātauranga Māori, then the traditional knowledge that exists within the Pacific and right through Latin America around how we can be living sustainably with our environment. And I think those are all voices that can be brought to bear, and there's again that common thread between the regions in terms of that much more holistic approach to some of the really gnarly challenges that we have. And I reflect back on some of the awesome work that the Cape had done in terms of connecting rangatahi Māori with Chilean scientists around climate change, and the kind of kōrero that was happening there, and the opportunities to support and encourage more of those linkages being made with an Indigenous connection, but to play it into many different spaces than I think we've probably done to date.
Thank you, Jackie. David, I'd just like to pick up some of the thoughts that Jackie had done, but taken in a context which actually Tim referred to, track 2 or 1.5 diplomacy. Some people in the room will know what that means, others may not. But dialogues effectively between academics and officials to broaden the relationship and to test some ideas, and sometimes just between without the officials too. So you've been in many of these dialogues, primarily in the Asian context, but not only in the Asian context. Can you just give some examples of where you think that where you've seen Australia and New Zealand working together to impress a common vision on third parties and how that's gone down.
Well, thanks, Matthew. And first of all, can I just say thank you for the opportunity to be part of this this event and this panel tonight. And can I echo the praise that's gone for the Cape's good work and also for John's really terrific work in putting this both of these papers together. And I should say we've spent a lot of time talking about the content of the words that are there. But if you did get a chance to have a look at one of these outside, I really urge you to, because they also have these very beautiful illustrations, these photographs, which very modestly, though, if you look at the photography credits on the inside, you'll see also John's contribution as well. And so a very beautiful looking as well as a very important and I think stimulating paper. That's right. So Matthew, I have been involved for most of my experience has been in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific context of Track 2 or Track 1.5 diplomacy. Really the idea that academics and think tankers can work with officials to thicken up some of the connections that might already exist, or perhaps to begin connections where there aren't already government-to-government links and conversations around a range of issues. And it's funny, in the region I know best, Southeast Asia, in some ways, sometimes I think the bigger dilemma is actually one of separating perceptions of Australia and New Zealand. Very often we're conflated together, and so I think there's often work that has to go on to actually do a bit of brand deconfliction and clarification. But that said, I think there are a number of good examples where it has been possible for an Australia and New Zealand to work collaboratively in Track 2 and Track 1.5 dialogues with Southeast Asian counterparts anyway. One grows out of some of the economic connections that Tim mentioned earlier that came out of the ANZFTA, the ASEAN CER connection, where the Integration Partnership Forum was a group of former officials and academics that worked with Australian counterparts and also Southeast Asian counterparts to begin to be talking about some of the processes that had evolved through the evolution of CER and how this might work in an ASEAN CER connection. And I think that's now in something like its 7th or 8th iteration. It had a meeting just in Auckland in May, and I think has proven valuable. The other one is a Track 2 connection with Australia, New Zealand and ASEAN. Australia represented by the Asia Link think tank, the New Zealand group led by the Asia-New Zealand Foundation, working with think tanks from across ASEAN, talking about regional security challenges. So I think there are the possibilities there. There are issues around scale, around resources, around having a champion, but it strikes me that it's not beyond the wit of the three parties or other parties in the context of Latin America to come up with something similar.
Thank you for those remarks. For those who don't know David, I should have said it's Director of the Centre for Strategic Studies. So I have to ask him a question about geopolitics. To what extent do you think shared Pacific security interests could feature more prominently than they do in the broader engagement between New Zealand and Latin America? In other words, behind you, linking that sea, how much can it be more a part of the story about why Latin America matters to New Zealand and why New Zealand matters to Latin America?
I mean, I think we need to be realistic about the extent to which the Pacific is going to be at the centre of conversations New Zealand has with Latin American counterparts. I think the report actually does a really good job, actually, of being realistic and pragmatic about the extent to which the Pacific is going to be part of New Zealand's interests with Latin America. It's pragmatic and realistic and makes some very practical suggestions for areas where conversations will be possible. But that said, so I don't think we should overstate that importance, but at the same time, the one thing that strikes me almost everywhere I go is a growing uptick in interest in the Pacific. I was in Eastern Europe just a couple of weeks ago where I met with a representative of a country's foreign ministry, and he said to me the one thing he was really interested in, what more could my fairly small country do in the South Pacific? We want to have more of a presence there. And if that's what's happening, those are the conversations you're having in Eastern Europe, then that in places across Latin America, that's going to be happening more and more. And I think the report makes these very important arguments about thinking about how to engage, listening to the Pacific's own priorities. The place of the Pacific at the centre of the report is really important here. And also not, even with the best of intentions, overwhelming limited capacity in the region. But I think there are already some opportunities that can be taken advantage of. And the ambassador mentioned Chile's participation in the South Pacific Defence Ministers meeting process. And there, one of the ideas that was put forward by Chile in the last meeting was the beginning of an academic network of connections working with on some of these security issues. So there are possibilities, there are some of these seeds that are already being sown.
Thank you. Just wonder if any of you wanted to respond to any other the remarks that any the others have said.
I was just going to add, I think that thickening up of the institutions and the dialogue and the opportunities that already exist would be really valuable. I think about, the numerous kind of trade initiatives that have been established with Latin America, and what are the opportunities to bring more Pacific into those conversations, more Indigenous people into those conversations, so that we're just trying to build out on those things that we already have, as opposed to creating new frameworks.
I'd just like to add one little grace note to the conversation, and that is the new port of Chankay, I think, is going to be extremely strategically important within the next 20 years. And the reason for that being, as the ambassador has explained to me on an earlier occasion, because railway links are being now drawn into the heartland of Brazil, the giant of Latin America. So this sort of traditional Australasian view of Brazil and Argentina being Atlantic-focused, I think was fair enough at the time and probably still correct. But I think the huge power of China over the economic future of the giant in Latin America, as well as the other countries of interest, to have a similar view of the China economic relationship as we do and the Australians do. I think this all sort of brings again this added dimension of shared interests with Latin America, but no longer just on the coast, the Pacific Alliance. I still, I put a lot of emphasis on the Pacific Alliance when I was trade minister, and got very close, I thought, to establishing then an agreement. It was just, President Santos was just so, and understandably, I'd have to say, concerned about any controversy in rural Colombia, given the progress he was making with FARC at the time, that it simply couldn't come together. And he said to me several times, because I met him many times, we love the idea. It's just right now I can't move in this way. So I just think that in the last 10 years, that dimension is, we just need to keep a little more open mind now to, in fact, the whole of the interest of the Latin American continent, particularly the giant now, is also moving in towards Asia in the same direction.
Interesting. Any other final comments that any of you would like to make about the report? Because we'll have 5 minutes or so for Q&A, and also a chance to meet all the speakers afterwards. But do you want to go to the room? Let's go to the room. If we're going to go to the room, we might have to invite John to come down and join us here, just in case any of the questions are for you. If you would like a question, please wait for a microphone to come to you, and we'll get them round. And say who you are, please, and please ask a question rather than make a statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Just wondering, because from our, how do I say it? I can't see New Zealand or Australia has even, any other country has even closer relationship between New Zealand or Australia as it is with CER, and all those New Zealanders move there to work, and so many people go there. So I actually thinking, because of the CER only talking about goods and service, I actually wondering whether there is any sort of about people. But anyway, that's actually, sorry, it's not most relevant to this tonight's question. I'm just not 100% sure what New Zealand really, Australia really trying to do in terms of being like Latin America. And you mentioned China, a lot of time they're talking about their military threat or whatever. I was just wondering, for China, is 28% of our exports market, and I haven't really seen many of from South America. I'm just wondering, for all this attitude, sometimes a little bit split about whether we want to be friendly to China or whether we don't want to, especially for next American.
Just keep the question short, please.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how do you actually keep the balance of keeping this market, but in some ways, I'm not sure New Zealand's role between the South Pacific and say, South America. Are we trying to be the middle person?
I think we've got the question. Does anyone wish to respond to that one quickly?
I mean, I think this really comes down to the biggest single foreign policy dilemma that Australia and New Zealand and many other countries face, which is, are we going to be forced to take sides? And I was really pleased. I've got a lot of time, by the way, for Penny Wong, and that's not just a political statement. She's formidable. I dealt with her when she was climate change minister. And I think she's been extremely helpful in lowering the temperature for the Prime Minister of Australia and the leader of China to find some modus vivendi. But, I mean, this is the big issue facing us going forward. And, I mean, I could speculate on whether it will be fundamentally different if Trump wins than if Kamala Harris wins. But either way, the anti-China sentiment in Washington is so deep, running so deep, that this is the number one issue we both face. And all I can say is I use the same metaphor I've used in countless speeches I've made on the subject, which is this, that, if you want to stay in the circus, you've got to learn to ride two horses at once. Now, I've always acknowledged that if there comes a point in which if the two horses decouple completely, you've got to decide what you want to do. I'm rather in favour of rather than just jumping on one horse or the other, just sitting on the floor of the circus and sulking would be my approach.
Sure, mainly to the report writer, if you don't mind. I'm just thinking about the focus on long-term thinking and a strategy that's sort of 5 to 20 years into the future. That sort of, to me as a student, makes me think about educational opportunities, but you didn't really talk about that apart from declining enrollment since COVID in terms of international students, that kind of collaboration. Do you have any thoughts on the proposed new institution on whether it should be tackling education and workforce collaboration as well as sort of that trade and economic aspect? Thank you.
I don't think we have a new institution just yet, but I think the people-to-people links are key. Over time, they're kind of the glue that holds things together. We've seen that in the case of Asia. I mean, people talk about the Colombo Plan, for example. When I was ambassador in Chile, there was the working holiday scheme that saw thousands of Latin Americans come to New Zealand and then head back home with sort of a feeling of connection to New Zealand. And I think academic links are really important. And I think at this point, I'd hand over to you, Matthew, because this has been a big focus of what the Cape has done over the last few years.
Thank you, John. It's actually been a particular focus of what we've done over the last few months because in April, a delegation of New Zealand universities went to Latin America. Professor Frank Bloomfield from the University of Auckland's here. He led that delegation, but it was on behalf of Universities New Zealand. And I think it could potentially, I mean, fingers crossed, it could have a few ripples because I think that everyone who went on that delegation, 5 New Zealand universities, I think they did understand the Latin American opportunity. We were looked after well by New Zealand government, but we were also received well by the Latin American institutions we spoke with. So maybe for our Australian friends, maybe there's going to be a little bit of competition in that area after all, because I think that there's, who knows, but there's potentially a new focus of this. And I personally, I would say this because I'm based at a university, but I do think academic links can be a big part of the future relationship between New Zealand and Latin America. And they already are to a degree, especially with Queensland and Victoria, with states in Australia. So this can grow. And I'm quite confident of that. And so, we are going out of business soon, but we're trying to leave a few legacies as we go. And one of them is to boost those academic links.
Kia ora. Thank you very much for your time today, everyone. I'm Harry Jackson. I actually recently interned at the New Zealand Embassy to Mexico. A pleasure meeting you with your delegation a few months ago. An experience I had in Mexico was often a question of distance. in that a lot of Mexicans I engaged with were very interested in New Zealand, but found New Zealand to be so very far away and the challenges that posed for more engagement. And I'm curious about whether this strategy, with a focus on networks and ideas, can overcome that perception of distance and how distance might influence that strategy. And that's for anyone to answer if they're happy to do so. Thank you.
No, it was a hospital pass. Harry, nice to see you. My wife is a professor of Italian, and every few years we would go to Italy and see friends in Italy, and we would say, "Great to see you. We hope one day you'll come to New Zealand." And they would say, "We would love to, but it's such a very long way." And I'd be like, "You do realise it's the same distance in both directions." And of course it is, but there's something about flying to Latin America, I know, when you fly, that feels, obviously the flying distance is the same as to San Francisco or Los Angeles, but there's something psychologically very different. And I think it does speak to one of the things that I think needs to underpin a closer relationship is connectivity. And that still is a real challenge. So I'm afraid I don't have I don't know which comes first, the flights or the perceptions, but I think you've put your finger on something that does need to change.
This is well known to a number of you, but just to add to that still this concept of the Southern Route is still a valid thing for us to keep in the back of our minds. And I simply don't know enough about the economics of aviation. By the way, for those of you not familiar with it, it's that the fastest way to get to East Asia from Latin America is actually, because of the curvature of the Earth, via New Zealand, not Australia. It saves about 1 hour, I think. So you would get transit traffic. But sooner or later, Latin America will want to extend its aviation links with East Asia even more. And that still remains an option. So I hope that could come into play at some point.
Thank you, John. Thank you, panellists, for those great remarks. I think we've got a lot to talk about. I think you've at least got a sample of what the report is saying, what it's focusing on, what it's not over-promising. Speaking about over-promising, I don't want to say we're going to go out with a massive blast, but in October we are going to do a final event, and we're going to reflect on the work that the Cape has done and where the relationship will stand without us, if that doesn't sound too self-interested. We will, however, first want to thank everyone here for being part of this. There will hopefully be a launch of the Australian report at least, and arguably the Pacific one in Australia, possibly next month. So stay tuned for information about our final activities. As you leave the room, I will put on a website which is called Wayfinding, which talks about shows of relationships. If you haven't seen it, think it. But right now, I'd like you to thank all our speakers for a wonderful presentation, including our Deputy High Commissioner and the Ambassador and our Chancellor. So please join me in thanking them all and in chatting afterwards and sharing ideas which you want to test a little bit further. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate you being here.